Okay, welcome everyone. We're so excited to have you on this second of the Farm to School 101 webinar series from the Minnesota Farm to School leadership team. And we're covering lots of hot topics around farm to school, but today this second webinar is focusing on maybe the thing we get the most questions about. We're going to be talking about how to buy local foods for your school meals and what's allowed, hearing from some expert panelists, some leadership team members, and food service experts who have had success doing this themselves. So we're really excited to bring this information to you. We also have some resources to share, and we can answer your questions as well as we go forward. So if you all as attendees would like to introduce yourselves, you can do that in the chat. And I am going to pass it over to my colleague Sammy, and we'll have the members of the Farm to School leadership team introduce ourselves to all of you.
Yeah, I'm Sammy Burrington. I work for the Minnesota Department of Education on Farm to School.
Hi, I'm Jane Jewett. I am with the Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Agriculture at the University of Minnesota.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Siebold. I work for the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and lead our farm to school work.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Annalisa Hultberg, and I'm an extension educator statewide at the University of Minnesota in food safety. So I work with fruit and vegetable farms and others around on-farm food safety for produce farms.
Wonderful. And I'm Erin McKee. I'm the Community Food Systems Program Director at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. And I see in the chat that a couple of familiar names are popping up. It's great to see all of you. We're really excited to share with you today. So if you go to the next slide, just before we get into the content, I wanted to do a little housekeeping. We would love to be able to answer your burning questions about local food purchases today. When you are asking questions, if you have questions for the presenters, please use the Q&A box instead of the chat, just because in the chat, we'd love it if you have little comments or little notes that you want to share, or even links or resources. That's great. We don't want your questions to the panelists to get lost in the shuffle there. So if you use the Q&A, that helps us to track the questions, and we'll actually have some formal Q&A time at the end where we'll make sure that we try to get to as many of those as we can. And I also wanted to share, we are recording this webinar. We'll send the recording, a link to the recording, to all of the registrants afterwards, and we'll have that posted online too if you want to go back. So you don't need to furiously write down all the links that we share or anything. We will share the content with you afterwards as well. And I am going to pass it over to Kate to get started.
Yeah, so we just wanted to start by mentioning the Minnesota Farm to School leadership team, in case anyone hasn't heard about it. But the 5 of us who just introduced ourselves, we are each members of the Minnesota Farm to School leadership team, which is a group of folks from agencies and organizations across our state that are committed to supporting and advancing farm to school work. And so we work on everything from farm to school month planning to visioning for our state, and providing things like this webinar to provide support to schools. So one other way that we provide support that we want to make sure to mention is that we host farm to school technical assistance office hours on the second Wednesday of every month at 2:30, and you can register once. We can put the link in the chat. But it's a great way to come with questions. We're there to answer questions that folks have. And so, you might leave today's webinar and have a question come to mind later. And so this would be a great place to come and get some answers and resources. We also have our farm to school informal check-ins, which are really designed for school nutrition professionals. And those happen on the first Wednesday of every other month at 2 p.m. And that's just a place to share updates. We can discuss kind of hot topics and also talk about kind of what are some barriers in farm to school in Minnesota and how can we overcome them. So just 2 plugs for things that we hope we might see you at later on. And so we have a busy agenda today. We know that farm to school procurement is a big topic. So we're going to try to touch on the big points, but know that we're not going to get to everything. And we'll mention some opportunities we have coming up to kind of take a deeper dive into specific aspects of what we'll be talking about. But we're going to talk about how to find farms, planning and drafting specifications for local food items, different procurement methods. We'll talk about food safety that you should be thinking about. And then we're really excited. We're going to hear from an expert. Rachel from Mesabi East School District is going to share how their district goes about local purchasing and what procurement methods and practices they use and how they build relationships with farmers. And then at the end, we'll have hopefully a little time for Q&A. Now we'll pass it to Sammy.
All right, so today, like Kate said, we're focusing in on procurement. We'll briefly just go through the what, why, how of procurement, and keep in mind, these are principles that pertain to all procurements that you use with your child nutrition dollars and budget, including buying local food. So that's why we're talking about it in relation to farm to school today. So what does procurement even mean for those of you that might be new to that word? It really is the buying of goods and services, even local foods. So today we're really talking and targeting about those procurements around local foods. And then this brings us to the why. Why are procurement rules and regulations even important? They really ensure that the program benefits are received by eligible schools and then on to the eligible children, and that the taxpayer dollars, which they are used effectively and efficiently with no waste or abuse. And because of this, USDA has basic procurement standards in place, and you'll see them listed here. The Buy American provision that requires schools to purchase domestic commodities and products to the maximum extent practicable. So you can see right there, local foods fits right in with these. State and local regulations must also be followed. We do have some Minnesota state statutes around procurement thresholds, which you'll learn about here coming up. Also, full and open competition really is the most important principle of a sound procurement, and competition really is essential to ensure that schools are able to purchase those high quality goods and services at the lowest possible price. And you can do this even in local food purchasing, hopefully in most regions of the state. And then again, always awarding your contracts or your purchases to those responsible and responsive vendors. They need to be responsive and responsible in order to win your purchase. Responsive really means the vendor conform to all the school's stated terms and conditions or product specs. And responsible means the vendor is capable of performing those successfully under those product specs or that purchase agreement. So moving into the procurement process and what this looks like and more of the how does this happen, all child nutrition program operators should refer to these 5 basic steps, and it is regardless of either method of procurement you choose, whether it be informal or formal. These 5 basic steps pertain to that. So you'll see here planning. This includes forecasting and budgeting and walking through some questions around like, what do you even need to buy? Are they available for purchase? If so, when? And are they available locally? If so, woohoo. Will you need delivery or will you pick them up? When and where do you need them? And then how much will you need? So much of that we already talked about in our previous menu develop webinar. But then also the second step is drafting those specs. This is written documentation that will include all the details of what you need, like a description, the requirements, and those specifications of those goods and services. And so this can be as simple as writing something down in what you need on a piece of paper and in an email or Word doc. And then you collect quotes or advertise a solicitation depending on the procurement method you choose and the dollar amount of the purchase. Once you draft it, you just provide the information to all potential vendors. So it could be all the farmers markets, food hubs, or it could be distributors and other businesses in your area too, who might be able to fulfill your needs as described. And this may simply mean calling or emailing potential farmers in your area. And then you award the contract or make the purchase to the most competitive vendor who is able to meet your needs and provide the goods that you're looking for. And then you just manage the contract if you decide to go that route with a formal procurement method, which we'll talk more about here coming up. But it really is important to understand these 5 basic steps, and because they do have a purpose. And while they may seem like rigid, they do allow for some flexibility and innovation to ensure that your school really is receiving the goods and services that meet your needs at the best prices, especially around local foods. And then, yeah, if you click one more, and then just remember, at the heart of all these are just what we talked about, those 4 procurement principles, by American, those state and local regulations, remembering free and open competition, and then also awarding to the responsible and responsive vendor. Next slide. So here they are. Here are those methods. You'll see on the left, informal procurement, and on the right, formal, informal, and formal. There really is a lot here on this slide, and we could likely go into a full day's worth of detail on all of this, but basically procurements can be split into 2 different methods, informal and formal. The cutoff mostly lies in the procurement amount. So informal procurements would include micro purchases and small purchases. Micro purchases are for those procurements under $10,000. Small purchases are for procurements under $250,000 for non-public schools, and then under $175,000 for public schools. So it's a matter of a federal threshold and our Minnesota state threshold. And even if the procurement amount is less than $10,000, you can still utilize the small purchase method. It's just a must. When it's over that amount, you must use the small purchase method. Any procurement over the small purchase threshold must be procured using the formal procurement method. And again, with this, even if the procurement is under that small purchase threshold, you might choose as a SFA to still use the formal procurement method. And there might be some benefits in doing this. Then you'll see there are just 2 different kinds of formal procurements, IFBs and RFPs, and we'll talk a little bit about when you would use either or for local purchases. And you'll again hear from Rachel, who uses an RFP at Mesabi East. So we'll come back to this in a little bit again. I'll hand it over to Kate.
Great, thanks, Sammy. So one step that wasn't necessarily in those 5 steps that Sammy said, but that we kind of added at the bottom is finding farms. So if you're looking to do local food procurement, that's kind of a step that can be happening kind of continuously over, from the planning to the drafting of specs, and then to the time when you're collecting quotes or putting together an RFP or some sort of formal procurement method. So we just wanted to spend a little time providing some strategies and suggestions for how you can find farms and local food to source. And so first off, just a reminder that as you're getting started with local sourcing, or you're looking to expand what you are buying locally, it's really good to set your definition of how you define local food. And really, there is no single like USDA definition that schools need to follow, nor is there one set by the state. Really, it's down for the school to define. And so you can pick a definition that you think fits best for your goals in local sourcing and the farms and products you're wanting to buy, and where you're located. So it could be that you define local as being within 200 miles of your school. Maybe it's within your county, within the state border of Minnesota, or maybe it's the Midwest region and all of our neighboring states. Your definition of local could also change depending on the season or the product. So maybe it's 200 miles for produce, but for meat or other products, it's a little bigger. Again, it's really just thinking what works for your operations and what you're looking to do. One thing that also may help to define your local definition is if you do have a specific funding source that does have its own definition of local. So one thing I'll mention, if any of you on this call today are an Agri Farm to School grant recipient through Minnesota Department of Agriculture, for that grant, we do require that that reimbursable food purchases be made in the state of Minnesota. So that's just one thing to mention. You as a district may normally define 200 miles, but if that 200 miles were to reach into another state, So anything purchased outside of Minnesota would not be reimbursable for your Agri Farm to School grant. You can still purchase it, you just can't get reimbursed through that specific grant program. So just one thing to note. So finding farms, there's a lot of different ways to do this. These are just a few suggestions that we thought we'd share. The Minnesota Grown Wholesale Directory is a website that you can visit that has a map and a search feature to find farms. You've maybe visited the Minnesota Grown Directory for like the direct consumer side, but there is a specific wholesale directory that has farms that are interested in selling wholesale, including to institutional outlets like schools. So that is a great place to go. The farmers markets are a great place to find farmers. And so the Minnesota Farmers Market Association has a website where you can find markets near you. Similarly, the Farmers Market Food Hub site has a map with locations, and we'll also talk about that market hub model later. And then Farm Direct Minnesota is a Facebook group, but social media is another place that we can get a lot of information these days. And so you may be able to find some names of farms near you on the social media, like something like Farm Direct, and connect with them. And then I would just encourage you to ask around. The conversations and word of mouth is a great place to get some suggestions of farms in your area. So ask other schools around you, are you doing any local purchasing? Who do you work with? Are there restaurants in your area that are buying local? And then also connect with your county-based extension educators, your local public health SHIP coordinators, farm service agency office. These are all regional office spaces that are working with farmers, and they may be able to help connect you with some farms in your area. And then I also would encourage you, as you're reaching out to farms, to be intentional about reaching out to emerging farms in your area and building relationships with them. The term emerging farmer may be familiar to some of you, or it may be new. And it really is, emerging farmers include historically underserved communities, including BIPOC farmers, immigrants, women farmers, persons with disabilities, young and beginning farmers, LGBTQ+ farmers, and others. And in this regard, really the definition encompasses those who are new to farming, but also individuals who have potentially been farming for many generations, but were outside the scope of traditional state and federal agricultural support programs. And for that reason, they've faced specific barriers to accessing new markets that other farmers haven't. And so the state of Minnesota is really working to support our emerging farmers in accessing new markets, and schools is a really great opportunity for new market access and growth for farms in our state, including our emerging farmers. And so one example of that is if you are an Agri recipient, Agri Farm to School grant recipient through MDA, you may recall in your grant application answering a question about how you were planning to work with emerging farmers. And so just wanted to share this kind of definition to remind you of what it means, since it is a fairly new definition that's being used in our state. And if you're looking to connect with emerging farmers, there isn't one specific list to go to. It's really about connection building, but these are some ideas of where you may be able to go to build connections with emerging farms in your area. So asking local distributors or food hubs near you, if they source from any emerging farmers, they may be able to help you connect with them. Again, go to a farmer's market or strike up conversations at other community places like places of worship, nonprofit or cultural organizations, restaurants, grocery stores. And then there's also the link here. It goes to the Support for Emerging Farmers website that we have. But one suggestion is just to reach out to farm to school supporters and connectors in your area. And that goes back to the local SHIP people, your extension educators. And I'll also mention all of the presenters on this call today are also here to help connect you with folks. And so don't be shy to reach out. Food and market hubs is also a great way to source local food and connect with farmers. So the Good Acre Food Hub is located in Falcon Heights, Sprout is in Little Falls, and there's the Farmer Market Hub that has locations all across the state. And hubs are really places that are aggregating or bringing together product from multiple farms. And so reaching out to one of the hubs in our state is a great way to build connection to multiple farms and be sourcing from several different farms in your region. And so I would encourage you to consider that as well when you're doing local sourcing. And you also can buy local foods from other businesses, not necessarily just directly from the farm. So maybe it's yogurt you're looking to buy, or local flour, other things. Make sure to, again, talk with other schools about where they're buying it, what companies they may be working with. Ask distributors, your prime vendors, what are local foods that you offer. You may be buying some local food already that you don't realize. And then there's also events like Renewing the Countryside's Feast Local Trades Show that happens every year. That's a great place to go to find different local products that are available and think about how they may be able to fit into your menu and operations. And with that, I'll pass it back to Sammy to talk about drafting specifications.
Yeah, so a lot of the planning has to do with finding farmers and local foods like Kate just talked about. But also we'll just walk through each of these 5 steps now a little bit more in detail. Next slide, Kate. So like we've already said, the planning part of this procurement stage, we've already gone through in another webinar, but just briefly, here are some things to think through. In addition to your menu, finding local foods, you need to think about the staffing that you have, the labor, the operations, what it looks like, your kitchen model, your food service operation, the equipment that you have or might need to bring in more local products, and then also the seasonality and availability of local foods in your region or area of the state. We recorded that whole webinar, so if you would like to listen and you didn't, just reach out to us and we'll share it with you. Roseville and Becker also share great examples. So now moving into drafting product specs. After you do all the planning in the background, knowing what local foods you'd like to buy, it's really time to start writing it down. And again, it can be as simple as writing it down on a notebook, paper, or in an email. How you write those product specs really depends on how you answer these questions here. And it's okay, like I think it's gonna pop up. It's okay if you don't know the answers to all of these questions. Simply just write it down based on what you can answer. So how much do you need? How often do you need that? Is it every week on the salad bar? What size, shape, and quality do you need? Do you need some big old sweet potatoes like this lady in Minneapolis? Think about how you'll be using it. If you're just peeling it, slicing it, dicing it, maybe you can bring in larger product. How do you want to receive it? Does it need to be cleaned and washed? How do you want it to be packed? Do you want it to be frozen? When do you need it, and how much flexibility do you really have with those answers? So here are a few examples you can use as a starting point. Think of product specification as really your written and detailed shopping list, something that each vendor or farmer that you contact receives. They receive all the same information, so it really is a fair game for all farmers and vendors. These are all product specs for carrots you'll see here. So at the top, you'll see Minneapolis Public Schools written product specifications for orange carrots. You'll see in the next column how the carrots will be used, what size they need, how they should be delivered and cleaned, the dates and the frequency of the deliveries, and then in the far right-hand box, the total quantity that they need. At the bottom, the Good Acre Food Hub uses these pictures as product specs with their farmers. This does help with some language barriers and not. It's just nice to see a visual picture of like what's needed and what we can accept, what we can and what we can't, the size and how it should be packaged, and how the box or case should look. And then here's just one more example of more of Minneapolis's product specs. So you'll see cauliflower, celeriac, cucumber, and green beans. I do have many other examples of local product specifications that Minnesota schools have used. So if you want, especially more product specs around meats or grains, feel free to reach out to any one of us and we can get those examples to you. So I need to point it out because USDA also makes a big point about it, but based on how USDA regulation was written, local can't be like actually written like, I want local carrots. It can't actually be written as a product spec. USDA sees this as limiting competition, but it's okay because we can still get around that. There are other ways to target local products without actually writing it as a product specification. And we'll actually get into more of those details here in a bit. But before we do that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Annalisa, to talk more about food safety.
Great. Thanks, Sammy. So I'm going to do just a brief overview about on-farm food safety as it pertains to produce and your purchasing from local fruit and vegetable growers. So next slide. Just to be clear, and Jane will also mention this, but you are able to purchase directly from farmers, from fruit and vegetable farmers, as per our state constitution, if they grew the product and they don't add any off-farm ingredients, they don't have to have a license of any sort to sell you that food. So you are able to go from them. It's completely legal. So we just wanted to make that real clear. It's called product of the farm. All right, next slide. And there is a little bit more about product of the farm. So again, they have to own the property or rent it, and they grow that product and they sell it to you. They can do some light processing, for example. They still don't need licensure. If you have questions on that, as we get into more difficult processing sort of questions, then you can reach out. Next slide. So something that some farmers have that comes up sometimes as a question is a gap audit. So a gap audit is something that a grower can choose to get to verify their food safety practices. It's voluntary, it's not a law. And so the farmer pays a third party, almost always somebody from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. Inspections Division comes out, does that audit, and the farmer pays for that service. It generally is $500 to $1,000. It could be even more if you're getting lots of crops audited. It's an annual audit that farmer would pay for that product. So then they're able to offer you, say, a certificate that says their lettuce and their beets have a gap audit on them. It is not a legal requirement, and there aren't a whole lot of farms kind of at that really large wholesale level that sell into markets that do require that audit. Therefore, we don't have that many farms that have a gap audit. So that's not to say that we don't have farms with good food safety, because our farms have good food safety, but they just, the market hasn't necessarily historically required that gap audit here, so they don't get it because it can be quite expensive. So we just wanted to be clear that if you did say that that the grower had to have a gap audit, you'd be limiting yourself to maybe about 12 to 15 diversified vegetable farms that have that gap audit in the state. There are more audits on potato farms and apple farms, but in terms of those diversified veg operations, it's really just a handful, and they tend to be the quite large operations. Okay, so next slide. There are options for you to verify their good agricultural practices without that gap audit. So good agricultural practices are really just those things that a farm does as they grow and handle and pack and hold and transport their product to reduce the potential for any sort of foodborne illness on that product. So those good agricultural practices are things like washing their hands before they harvest, getting their water tested, cleaning and sanitizing the food contact surfaces, just like you would do in a kitchen. They also do that in the wash pack that they have there on the farm. It looks different than HACCP. It's similar to HACCP and your Serve Safe, but it's different because it's on a farm. So we talk about things like soil amendments and irrigation water and wildlife in the fields and way to reduce those kind of risks. So you can ask about their practices related to that. We have a short handout that will be in the materials sent to you afterwards. That kind of guides you through that conversation. You can ask for that written food safety plan. That will be just a few pages that the farmer could provide you. You can ask for them to test their water for bacteria like E. coli. That should be no detectable, so it's potable water. Just have a conversation about food safety. Visiting would be an excellent choice if you had the time as well. Next slide. So these are my major messages, just that they are safe and legal to buy. You don't have to ask for that gap audit. And just having that conversation, looking for a food safety plan, and visiting if you can. Also, feel free to reach out to our team that does the on-farm food safety education. That's it from me. And next to Jane to talk about meat procurement.
Thanks, Annalisa. Yep, so the next set of slides come from a project that was grant funded called Blazing Trails Through the Jungle of Food Regulations and originally funded by North Central SARE. Next slide. So like Annalisa said, locally grown product to the farm is an approved source of food without being licensed. Next. And that is in the state of Minnesota's constitution, and it's also in Minnesota statute. So if you are selling meat, poultry, or rabbit to a food business, it does have to be processed under inspection, under continuous inspection, which means an inspector is there at the plant every day, either USDA or Minnesota Equal To. And then there are grading, handling, and labeling requirements for shell eggs. Next. So locally raised meats and poultry and rabbit are legal for food facilities, including schools, to use if they're slaughtered and processed under that continuous inspection. That means an inspector is there every day and looks at every animal to verify that it's healthy, and looks at the plant to make sure it's operating in a sanitary manner. So there are two options. USDA plants, if it's processed there, you can cross state lines to sell the meat. And if it's Minnesota Equal To, it has to stay within Minnesota borders. And here's how you know. So every package of meat that has been done under inspection will have an inspection bug on it. If it's USDA, red meat is the first one on the left. USDA poultry is the next one. And then meat or poultry in Minnesota will have that Minnesota outline of the state inspection bug. Next. And then USDA considers animals that were historically wild game in North America to be non-amenable to inspection, which means that inspection is voluntary. And in Minnesota, these types of animals being sold as meat are required to be inspected. Minnesota says, yeah, if they're raised on a farm, they're meat, just like every other meat. We need them inspected. So in that case, if it's a USDA plant, they'll have this triangle bug indicating voluntary inspection, or in a Minnesota plant, it'll be the same state of Minnesota inspection mark. And that's how you know, every package would have that. So product to the farm means 100% product to the farm, no added ingredients. In that case, the farmer doesn't need a license. But what if there are added ingredients like ham, bacon, or sausage with seasonings added? In that case, you could still buy it locally from a local farmer, but that farmer has to have a food handler license from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. And depending on the details of the farmer's operation, that would either be a retail or a wholesale food handler license. So, yep, if you're looking for local meats with added ingredients, ask the farmer for their license. What about storage and transport, safe handling of frozen meat and poultry products? So if the farmer is licensed because of added ingredients, they have to follow Minnesota rules on general food handling practices. And if it's excluded from licensing, they're technically not subject to those rules, but the farmer is still responsible to make sure all food they sell is safe and not adulterated, which kind of circles them back around to following those Minnesota rules that guarantee that. Next slide. So here are the basics of those storage and transport rules. They need a sanitary storage area, storage in a freezer that will hold 0 degrees Fahrenheit or below for temp. Transport and delivery must be in enclosed containers that prevents contamination of the products. And the temperature of the product, if it's frozen, has to be maintained at or below 10 degrees Fahrenheit during handling and delivery. So that's the product temp, not necessarily the ambient air temperature inside of a box or a cooler. It's the product temp. Next slide. Just a little bit about wild harvested game. Generally, it can't be sold in commerce because it doesn't get a pre-slaughter inspection like it would at an inspected plant. But in some tribal settings, there's an exception. Next slide. So if there's a food service program that's serving more than 50% Native Americans, so which could be a school that's serving primarily Native American children, then it can accept wild harvested wild game or fish to be donated to that food service program. And then it's the food service's responsibility to verify that the donated game came in clean, wasn't spoiled or anything, and was handled in a sanitary manner. Shell eggs raised by the farmer who owns the flock. Those are legal for food facilities to use. They're product of the farm. However, if you have preschoolers or young primary grade children eating in the school food service, that can be an exception because those are defined as highly susceptible populations and pasteurized eggs are required for some purposes. So in that case, it's much easier on the food service staff to just use all pasteurized eggs rather than figure out when to use shell and when to use pasteurized. But if you are a school that could use locally produced shell eggs, not pasteurized, then there's this producer registration form with Department of Ag, which is voluntary, but you can certainly request it as part of your specs for procurement, require that the egg producing farmer have that registration. Any questions about meat, poultry, rabbit, or eggs? And there's my contact information, and I am happy to answer questions about meat regulations at any time.
Thanks, Jane. All right, now we'll get back into the nitty-gritties of the procurement methods. But feel free to enter your questions into the chat if any come up, or if you have any for Jane or Annalisa. So just as a reminder, here's what we talked about earlier, the two different types of procurement, both informal and formal, and really the cutoff lies in that procurement amount. What will you buy and how much does it cost? All right, so this chart, I will say, might be kind of small for you to read. I apologize about that, but it is in actually the newly released and edited USDA Procuring Local Foods Guide that they have. And so if you want, we can share the link to that in the chat too, or in a follow-up email. But really, you'll see at across the top, there are the 4 different procurement methods. So small or informal is split up into micro purchase and small purchase, and then formal is split up into those IFBs or RFPs. And then it just shows you when to use each one as a reminder. And then how to get the bids. So you can, for micro purchase and small purchase, you get to decide who you reach out to. So, you know, like going back to those product specs, you want to purchase carrots, you get to decide in both of those methods, who am I going to contact to get a price quote and see if they will meet these product specs that I have. So that's a way to target local products. And you'll actually see that at the bottom, I circled it, other ways to target local products. And so remember, we left off, you can't use local as a product specification, but you can target local products in many other ways. So again, this chart is just helpful if you forget after today, kind of these different methods. And I guess I will reiterate the difference between micro purchase and small purchase is the dollar amount, but with micro purchase, you do have to equitably distribute the purchases amongst the vendors. So if you have 2 carrot farmers in your area, you do have to, if you purchase from one, the next time you do have to purchase from the other one. And actually, I think that's the next slide maybe. Or is it a plug? It's a plug that I only have 5 minutes to talk about all these details of both of these methods, and I just won't have enough time today. But if you attend MSNA, please join me in our Finding Farmers Buying Local Food session, where I hope in an hour I can get into a little bit more detail around both of these methods. If nothing else, we are in the process, or I'm in the process of creating more resources around these to help you in procuring local products too. But we also already have some great resources developed. But here's what I was talking about. These are the different informal procurement methods broken down. And so the two basic steps of a micro purchase is where you contact a vendor or farmer, determine a reasonable price, and then you make the purchase. But if there are more than one qualified vendor in your area that you wish to purchase from, the next time you have to go to that other farmer. And then on the right, you'll see the 5 basic steps of a small purchase. So it looks a lot like those 5 steps we've already talked about, where you drop those specifications in writing, get it documented, and then you identify and gather 2 or more quotes from hopefully farmers, local farmers in your area that can provide that. You evaluate those quotes, and then you make the purchase and retain that documentation, and then just monitor the agreement that you set in place. And we talked about collecting quotes, and it really can be as simple as a chart or Excel spreadsheet or something written in your notebook that looks like this. So you have, that there's 3 farmers in your area. You have your product specs. You ask, you read off your product specs or send them to them in an email form, and they send back what they can provide, their quote. And if they're responsive and responsible, great. You then award or make the purchase to the vendor farmer that has the lowest price. And so I guess we gave away the clue, but I was going to ask you, based on this chart, who would the school, oh, thanks. Oh, who in this chart, or who should the school award their procurement to in this chart? And so you'll see Tom's and Vicky's Vines are both responsive and responsible. And then again, you just award it to the lowest price. So it looks like we're going with Vicky's Vines here on this one. And then just moving into formal procurement here, the 5 basic steps, again, looks very similar to our 5 steps we already talked about. Developing those specs in the first one, and then determining what solicitation tool you'll be using, either an IFB or an RFP. You draft that solicitation language that also includes those product specs. And it also includes evaluation criteria. So that's what makes formal procurement a little bit different. The other difference is in step 2, where you advertise and publicly announce. So that might look like reaching out to newspapers, and I don't know, that's kind of old school, but maybe they post it on their website. You send it out to probable farmers or vendors via email, post it on your school's website. As long as information is made publicly available, you can also contact those bidders directly. Minnesota state statute requires a minimum of 2 weeks for that advertising. You evaluate those responses based on the criteria you originally outlined in the solicitation. And then this documentation is super important, because you might be asked by vendors or farmers to provide that back to them to show that you demonstrated full and open competition. And then you award the contract or make the purchase for the vendor or farmer that was most responsive and responsible at the lowest price. And then you just maintain that contract or agreement that you had with them. There are differences in IFBs and RFPs, of course, and the biggest difference is that an IFB is issued after a complete and realistic specification has been written, and when the purchase or contract can be awarded solely based on price. You don't have any negotiation of price or terms in an IFB. So most oftentimes we see this in a purchase of maybe like fresh whole apples or ground beef, where an IFB would be issued. RFPs, again, are a request for proposal where you consider other factors other than just the price. Examples might be like technical expertise, if they can deliver within 48 hours or not, references from other schools that have used them as a local farmer. It's up to you to decide on that evaluation criteria that you'll want to use. But again, still keeping in mind full and open competition. Not only local vendors or farmers can submit a bid to this, it can be open to anybody who wants to submit a bid. And I am getting the call to keep moving on. So 2 more slides to go here. Here are good ways to use formal procurement, especially if you work with a food service management company. Really think about how you can incorporate local foods into those food service management companies' contracts from the very beginning. You do have to use our Minnesota MDE template for procuring a food service management company contract. So if you're a school that uses one, reach out to us, because it's vital to include language around local foods in those contracts right away. It's also a great tool for outlining and finding what you actually want. Also, planning for planning purposes, both for the farmer in the upcoming growing season and you as a school planning your menus for the upcoming school year. And then you might even find new farmers that you didn't know about. And then don't recreate the wheel. Like I said before, I have examples of this. Minneapolis has a farm to school toolkit available. And I think they're willing to share examples of their RFP too. So we can share that in the chat as well. But then you'll also hear from Mesabi East about their RFP. And actually that's a good transition here with after one more slide. Did we go through all of these? Oh, this is just an example of things that you should request within your RFP, which Rachel probably will talk about for farmers to respond to or vendors to respond to. So you can see as an example here on the bottom, again, this is Minneapolis's example of cauliflower, where they have the price per pound where the farmer puts that in, and also just other notes to consider as well, the quantity that they can provide. All right, with that, Rachel, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I'm Rachel Doherty with Mesabi East Schools. You can see that little gold star up in the corner. While we may be the largest school in our school square footage wise for the county of St. Louis County, we have a hard time getting some of our producers to be able to come on board with Farm to School. So I thought I'd share just a few things on how we've become more successful with Farm to School. Next slide, please. So for Mesabi East, we've been involved with Farm to School for 5 years now. Our RFP looks vastly different than what Minneapolis schools looks like. Minneapolis schools is a little bit more comprehensive than ours. So we have actually taken Aiken County's RFP and we retooled that and revised it to better fit our smaller school district. We keep it as simple as possible. We have held some virtual meetings. They haven't worked well for our area. We find that more face-to-face time and or just a simple phone call seems to work a little bit better on bringing them to the farm to school process and having just an open dialogue of emails. We send out our RFP. Previously, we announced it in January with then awards going out in mid-April. We are upping that timeline here starting this year where our announcement will go out in December and then it will follow up with follow-up questions in January and then award in March. We run a committee that goes over all of our RFP. The committee then is made up of members of our community, are some from staff and administration as well. They choose what we need to look forward to is in our RFP, what we're maybe doing the promotion of our vegetable of the year. This year was carrot, last year was green beans. And then we send out those contracts out also virtually through email. They can find it on our website and then I also hard copy mail them out to some This then allows me to be the coordinator between not only that farmer and the our food director, but then also to our students as well. And we just, we try to keep it a little bit as informal as possible. That's how we have found to be successful, is maintaining that flexibility. Next slide, please. So when we started off trying to figure out how to find our producers, we actually applied through for a Minnesota Egg Grant in 2020 that allowed us to go to each an individual farmer or producer to allow us to make those connections. We also visited area farmers markets, and of course, social media is always a big win for us. We have quite a large following for our community on our social media pages. That it just allows us to branch out that way. The Rutabaga Project, SHIP, co-ops, those have also really allowed us to start finding our producers. Next slide, please. A lot of the times that's our first question that we will get from members of our community and from producers is, can we really buy, can the school really buy from me? And our number one thing that we ask about on our RFP is, yes, is it food safety? Do you have hand washing stations and produce washing stations? How do you wash your produce? Do you get your well water tested? And we have had the big capability in the past to partner up with different entities to help them in well water testing as well. We state that our local area is 75 miles, and they get a more bonus points, I guess you would say, versus then all the way out to statewide, because we do run full tray grants. We do keep everything, our local area, to being within the state of Minnesota. We find that it is really kind of difficult to team up with new producers because they are very uneasy on how the whole process goes. So it's a lot of hand holding. My job is a lot of making sure that we do have those connections constantly going from me, whether it's FaceTime or on a call. It's a big time commitment, this on your staff end. But again, we have those local entities that we can team up with. Essential Health has been great, the Rutabaga Project as well. So again, that full tray grant can be a great asset to you, and also that it allows for you to make those connections and then identify maybe what could be some holdups. What we've identified is that the chicken processing, it was difficult for our current staff, so we could not purchase those whole chickens that we had a bid on through our RFP. Next slide, please. So just building those relationships. I've talked about this at length, but yet I just can't emphasize it enough. The more that you can have that time with your producers, and especially if you can invite them into the school, once they see your students interacting with their product, that is usually the full win, and that's when they will come on board with you to be one of your producers. They get to know not only your staff, but also some of those students, and then tagging them in social media. So we do lots of pushes that way as well, showing them their product into different meals. We have schools, or in our school, we have different classes that not only are aiding in our local harvesting, but they will also aid on any cleanup or chopping or dicing of product into our recipes. So it just really ties everybody together on that. Social media can be a pretty good influencer for them. Next slide. All right, this one we're still working on. Every year we think we've got a kind of a handle held on it, and we realize that we do not. We realized really quickly this year that bell peppers were a massive hit. Sweet bell peppers were something we couldn't keep in stock on. So this is just kind of showing you what we purchased weekly and bi-weekly. This is pretty much for September and October, obviously. Beef, though, we do secure that 130 pounds. This year, we're going to do 130 pounds of ground beef per month from a producer. That what Jane talked about, though, the E2 and or USDA inspected, we here at Mesabi East find it a little hard to reach out to those producers that have that inspection criteria available to them. So it's something that you kind of need to work on. Nana Noodles, the previous lady that was pictured there, she does all handmade noodles with local product, and that is a great asset for us to be able to increase the different recipes that we can include. We do purchase a lot of wild rice here. We are very close to Boys Fort, and they so that relationship has been built, and we do cover a number of different recipes using wild rice. We've created new recipes both in the classroom, but also into the cafeteria as well. So while most of our farmers are just hobby farmers, that's why we have some of these constraints, because they are not full-time farmers. They have side jobs, and so it does sometimes have a little bit of influence on how our producers are meeting our needs. Mainly all of our product is delivered to us here at the school, which is very nice. That's one of the things that we try and caveat the most of, instead of us having to try and run down different products. So this was very quickly and tight, but if there's any questions, please reach out to email me, or you can ask Sammy about our RFP as well, and I will be more than happy to share our RFP. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I feel like it's so powerful to hear a tangible story from somebody who's actually doing the work to make this happen on the ground. And it kind of takes all of the details that our high level presentations are covering and kind of shows it in action. And we really appreciate you sharing how you make it work for your district. So thank you for sharing your story. We have just a couple minutes. If anyone has questions that they'd like to enter into the Q&A for Rachel or for any of our other panelists, we can try to get to them. And I did see there was one question that I think I'll direct to Sammy about if someone is planning to purchase local foods through a food hub, how do they share who they purchase from as necessary for the micro purchase threshold? So how do you do your record keeping for that purchase?
Yeah, so I think there's lots of things at play here, but the vendor in this case would be the food hub, not the individual farmers, right? Because you're actually purchasing from the food hub. So then you'd have to think, do I have other food hubs in my area? And quite often I have, because you have to do this equitable distribution, and most oftentimes schools have a preferred local vendor. I oftentimes suggest folks going with the small purchase method of informal, because all you have to do is you write down your product specs and then you award the vendor that's responsive and responsible at the best price. And then you can continue doing that. It's just, you have to write things down. And even with the micro purchase, you still have to write it down too. So you just might think about that. But yeah, in this specific example, your vendor is the food hub, if I'm reading it correctly.
Thank you, Sammy. And not seeing any other questions and seeing that we are at time, we covered a lot of ground in that 1 hour, and we will have more webinars covering more details. And then Sammy has her MSNA presentation that you can all come in and ask your detailed questions on procurement debt as well. But I just want to thank our panelists and our presenter, Rachel, again, for being here, for sharing your expertise and your experience, and for all of you for attending. We will follow up with all registrants to share a link to the recording of this webinar, and we'll also put together all of the links because there was a lot shared today. But thank you so much, and I am so thrilled to have recorded all of this great information. This was really, really helpful, and I enjoyed it. I hope all of you did too, and we hope that we'll see you in our next Farm to School 101 webinar. Have a great day, everybody.